They looked like ordinary kids, freckled cheeks, awkward smiles, backpacks slung over narrow shoulders. They went to school, played video games, and rode their bikes through quiet neighborhoods. But hidden beneath the surface was something darker. Something deadly. This isn't the story of hardened criminals or adult killers shaped by years of violence. This is the story of murderers whose crimes shocked the nation, not just because of how brutal they were, but because of how young they were. Today we journey through 5 of the most disturbing cases in American history. 5 children who killed with chilling intent. A 13-year-old who crushed a toddler's skull with a rock. A boy who hid his neighbor's lifeless body under his bed for days. A teen girl who murdered for the thrill of it, and wrote about it in her diary like a prize. These stories are real. The victims were real. And the killers? They were barely old enough to drive. If you're fascinated by true crime and want more real-life stories that will leave you speechless, make sure to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us daily for stories that will shock you to the core. Now let's dive in for today's cases. Case number 1, Eric Smith, the redhead with a rage. On August 2, 1993, in the peaceful town of Savona, New York, a young 4-year-old boy named Derek Roby, full of excitement and energy, set off alone to walk the short distance to his summer day camp, his mother reluctantly allowing him to venture out on his own for the first time, unaware that it would be the last time she'd ever see him. As Derek, carefree and innocent, walked down the street, unaware of the sinister presence that was lurking just off the path he'd normally take, a presence that would shatter the tranquility of the town and end his life in a brutal and horrifying way, because not long after his departure, as his mother waited for him to arrive at the park and realized that he had not yet returned, a knot of fear began to tighten in her chest, and by the time she began calling neighbors and contacting the police, it became clear that something was terribly wrong, prompting an immediate search that involved local authorities, neighbors and volunteers. Scouring the streets, the woods and every place in between, but it wasn't until several hours later that the unimaginable was discovered. Derek's lifeless body was found in a secluded part of the woods just yards from the path he was supposed to follow, and as the investigators began to examine the scene, they quickly realized that the violence that had been inflicted upon Derek was not just a random act, but a calculated, cruel and deliberate act of rage, as his small, fragile body showed signs of severe beatings, with rocks having been used to crush his skull, his face battered, his body violated in ways that made the very nature of the crime seem even more incomprehensible, and the town, once full of life and innocence, was now gripped with horror, as the search for the person responsible became a matter of urgency, with residents anxiously wondering, who could have done this to a defenseless child? As detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the details of Derek's final moments, all eyes turned to Eric Smith, a 13-year-old boy from the same neighborhood who, on the surface, seemed like an unlikely suspect. A shy, awkward teenager, frequently the target of bullying due to his appearance, with red hair, large glasses, and a quiet demeanor that set him apart from his peers. And though Eric initially claimed to have seen Derek earlier that morning, offering what seemed like innocent information, the more investigators delved into his story, the more his statements began to raise doubts as his account kept changing, shifting with each question asked, until, eventually, Eric confessed, and what he revealed in his chilling confession was something no one could have anticipated. He had lured Derek into the woods that morning, not out of malice toward the boy personally, but because of his own growing anger, frustration, and rage that had festered for years, and anger fueled by the constant bullying he endured at school. And with disturbing detail, Eric recounted how he had strangled Derek, how he had thrown rocks at the little boy's head, and how he had violated him with a stick, the act carried out not out of a need for revenge, but because of a deep, uncontrollable need to feel the power that comes with taking a life, to finally be the one in control in a world that had made him feel powerless. And the most unsettling part of all of this wasn't just the violence itself, but the complete lack of remorse Eric showed afterward as he casually covered Derek's lunch bag with leaves, wiped his hands and returned home, his expression unchanged as if nothing had happened, walking back into his house like it was just another normal day, a stark contrast to the brutal crime he had just committed. And while Eric's confession shocked everyone involved, from the investigators to the community, it also forced the question, how could a 13-year-old boy, seemingly so innocent, commit such a heinous and horrific crime? Eric Smith's case quickly became one of the most talked about trials in the country, as it challenged the very idea of childhood innocence and forced society to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that, sometimes young children, are capable of violence far beyond their years. And despite his youth, Eric was tried as an adult and convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to 9 years to life in prison. And though he was denied parole 10 times, claiming over and over that he had changed, he would remain behind bars for nearly 3 decades, until, in 2021, after serving 27 years, he was granted parole and released, now a 42-year-old man free to live the rest of his life. Though many still believe that no matter how much time passes, Eric will forever be the 13-year-old boy who murdered a child in an act of senseless rage. His release stirring up feelings of anger and confusion for those who still remember the chilling act of violence he committed, and as the town of Savona still carries the weight of Derek Roby's death, the question lingers: can a person ever truly change after committing such a crime? Case number 2, Joshua Phillips. Imagine a quiet neighborhood in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1998, where the warm breeze of the summer days gave no hint of the horror lurking just behind closed doors, and amidst the typical suburban setting of kids playing outside, Joshua Phillips, a 14-year-old boy who appeared harmless and just like any other teenager, was hiding a dark secret under his own roof, a secret that would change everything in the blink of an eye, for it was in this very neighborhood that 8-year-old Maddie Clifton, Joshua's cheerful and innocent neighbor, would become the victim of a crime so brutal and shocking that it would haunt the community forever. When, on the fateful day in November, Maddie, like any other child, went out to play, but never returned home, and with the panic setting in, her parents, neighbors, and even the entire town launched a search that lasted for days, desperately looking for the missing girl, but no one could have imagined where she was, because the truth was that the life of little Maddie had already been violently ripped away just hours after she left her house, when Joshua Phillips, in an unprovoked act of savagery, lured her into his home under the pretense of playing, before he would strike her in the head with a baseball bat, brutally bludgeoning the innocent child in what seemed to be a frenzied rage. And when that wasn't enough, in a horrifying escalation, he proceeded to stab Maddie multiple times, sealing her fate in the most gruesome way possible, his heart pounding with fear and panic after realizing what he had just done. And as the weight of his actions settled on him, Joshua made a chilling decision: to hide her body beneath his waterbed, concealing the crime in plain sight. But what seemed like a desperate, frantic attempt to cover his tracks would instead lead to an unraveling of a sinister truth, as the smell of decay began to fill the room, a stench so overpowering that it would be impossible to ignore. And for 6 agonizing days no one knew where Maddie was, the search continuing tirelessly, while Joshua kept the secret hidden beneath his bed, a secret he would take with him to the grave, or so he thought. But on the 6th day, as the smell grew worse and Joshua's own guilt began to weigh on him like an unbearable burden, his mother, unaware of what her son had done, went into his room to investigate the strange odor, and in a horrific turn of fate, it was she who made the discovery, opening the bed and finding Maddie's lifeless body concealed under the waterbed, hidden away for nearly a week. And at that moment, the truth came crashing down on Joshua, his carefully crafted lie collapsing in an instant as panic seized him and he was forced to confess to the unimaginable crime he had committed, telling his mother in a voice laden with fear and remorse that he had killed Maddie and hidden her body under the bed. And though the horror of his confession sent shockwaves through the family, the community, and the entire nation, the legal consequences were swift. Joshua was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and ultimately convicted, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, as he would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. But just when it seemed like the case had been closed, a twist emerged in 2017, when Joshua's case was revisited, and in a surprising turn of events, he was resentenced, now eligible for parole after serving nearly 2 decades, and though his age, his remorse, and his time behind bars were taken into account, many were left wondering if a boy who could commit such a chilling act at such a young age could ever truly change. And while Joshua now faces the possibility of freedom, one question remains: how can anyone ever truly atone for something so horrific as the murder of an innocent child? Case number 3, Lionel Tate. It was July 28, 1999 in Broward County, Florida. A regular summer evening that turned into one of the most disturbing true crime stories involving a child perpetrator in U.S. history. The tragedy unfolded inside a townhouse in the small neighborhood of Pembroke Park, where 12-year-old Lionel Tate had been left at home in the care of his mother, Kathleen Grosset Tate, a Florida Highway Patrol trooper. That evening, Kathleen allowed Lionel to babysit 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, a sweet and cheerful little girl who was a close family friend. Tiffany had come over to play while her legal guardian went out, assuming she'd be safe for just a few hours. What no one could have imagined was that this short visit would turn into a scene of unimaginable horror, one that still echoes through the American justice system decades later. While Kathleen rested upstairs, the 2 children were left alone in the living room. And what happened in those fatal 45 minutes is a mix of confusion, controversy, and sheer tragedy. According to Lionel, the two had been play wrestling. He claimed he was imitating moves he had seen on World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, which he watched religiously. In his police statement, Lionel described picking Tiffany up, slamming her onto the floor, hitting her head against a table, elbow dropping her, and even putting her in a wrestling hold. At first, it might sound like the overzealous imagination of a child trying to copy TV stunts, but the resulting injuries were anything but childish. Tiffany Unick suffered some of the most horrific internal injuries ever seen in a case involving a child offender. The medical examiner revealed that Tiffany's liver was completely shattered, split in half, something that usually only occurs in high-speed car crashes or catastrophic accidents. She had a fractured skull, numerous bruises on her body, lacerations to her spleen, and multiple broken ribs. Her pancreas was nearly destroyed. Her ribs had been compressed so hard that they cracked, and her small body was riddled with bruises that suggested a prolonged, sustained assault. Not a single unfortunate wrestling move gone wrong. Paramedics called to the scene were horrified by the brutality, initially believing the attacker had to be a full-grown adult. That belief was shared by many investigators who couldn't fathom how someone so young could inflict that level of damage. Tiffany had died from blunt force trauma. Her tiny body simply could not withstand the violent barrage that had been inflicted on her. When Lionel's story about wrestling began to crumble under the weight of forensic evidence, doubts grew about whether the incident was truly accidental. But here's where the case took a bizarre legal turn. Despite his young age, Lionel Tate was tried as an adult. Prosecutors argued that the sheer violence of the crime demanded justice and accountability. In January 2001, Lionel was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At just 14 years old, he became the youngest American ever sentenced to life in an adult prison. The decision sparked national and international outrage. Critics argued that Lionel, a boy who still played with action figures and believed in superheroes, could not possibly comprehend the full gravity of his actions. They believed the justice system had failed to consider his age, mental development, or the influence of violent media. Human rights activists, child psychologists, and legal experts weighed in, calling the sentence excessive and calling for reforms to how juveniles were prosecuted. Over the next few years, Lionel's legal team filed appeals, and public sentiment began to shift. In 2004, the courts agreed to a plea deal. Lionel's murder conviction was vacated, and he was released on a 1-year house arrest sentence combined with 10 years of probation and mandatory counseling. The idea was that with the right supervision and guidance, he might still find a path to redemption. But that hope was short-lived. In 2005, Lionel violated the terms of his probation by leaving his home without permission and carrying a knife. Then, in 2006, just 2 years after his release, he was arrested again, this time for robbing a pizza delivery driver at gunpoint. Police later found a loaded handgun in his possession, which he was forbidden from having as a convicted felon. The illusion that Lionel might have been rehabilitated shattered instantly. He was sent back to prison, this time for 30 years. In interviews and court statements, Lionel often portrayed himself as misunderstood and mistreated by the system. He insisted that Tiffany's death had been a tragic accident. But critics pointed to his continued violent behavior as proof that he had never accepted responsibility or shown genuine remorse. And even as an adult, Lionel appeared unable, or unwilling, to change the path his life had taken. So now, decades later, his name is no longer just a footnote in legal history, it's a sobering reminder of the complexities of juvenile justice, the power of media influence, and the chilling truth that sometimes, even children can commit acts of unthinkable violence. Was Lionel Tate a child who made a deadly mistake, or was he something far more disturbing, an early warning sign of a deeper, more dangerous pathology? Either way, the story of Lionel Tate forces us to ask some very uncomfortable questions. How should we punish children who kill? Can violent entertainment truly influence behavior to such an extent? And at what point does a child cross the line into criminal accountability? Case number 4. Alyssa Bustamante, murder for the thrill. In the suburban town of St. Martins, Missouri, in October of 2009, life was supposed to be simple, safe, and predictable. A place where kids could ride bikes down tree-lined streets and where neighbors greeted each other by name. But that illusion of security was brutally shattered on a chilly Wednesday evening when 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton failed to return home from a friend's house just a few blocks away, sparking a frantic, gut-wrenching search that would soon uncover a horrifying secret. Hidden behind a teenage smile. Elizabeth was the kind of girl everyone adored, Bubbly, sweet, close to her family and very cautious, even afraid of the dark. So when she didn't make it back by dinner time, her mother knew something was terribly wrong and immediately contacted the police, who launched an overnight manhunt with helicopters, search dogs and dozens of volunteers combing the woods and ditches of this small Missouri town. Unbeknownst to everyone involved in the search, Elizabeth's lifeless body was already lying cold in a shallow grave, barely covered by dirt and brush in a wooded area behind her killer's house. Her killer being none other than 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, a seemingly average teenage girl who lived 4 doors down from the Olton family, went to church regularly, kept decent grades in school and smiled wide in her yearbook photo, but harbored a darkness so deep that even her own family couldn't begin to comprehend what she was capable of. What made this case especially chilling was not just the brutality of the act itself, but the fact that it was entirely premeditated. Days before the murder, Alyssa had taken a shovel into the woods and dug 2 shallow graves, telling no one about her intentions, and on the day of the crime she waited for the perfect opportunity to lure Elizabeth into the trees under the innocent excuse of, "Come see something cool," knowing full well what she was about to do. And when Elizabeth followed her into the forest, she was ambushed. Alyssa reportedly strangled her with her bare hands, then slit her throat with a knife, and just to make sure Elizabeth was dead, she stabbed her repeatedly before dragging her lifeless body into the pre-dug grave and covering it up with leaves and dirt as if nothing had ever happened. When police grew suspicious of Alyssa, based on inconsistencies in her timeline and rumors she'd posted online about hating people and wanting to kill, they searched her bedroom and found something truly disturbing. A personal diary written in blue ink with a freshly torn page, but what remained of the entry from the night Elizabeth went missing sent chills through every investigator in the room. In her own words, Alyssa had written, "I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel." ATM was amazing. As soon as you get over the, "oh my god I can't do this" feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. "I'm kinda nervous and shaky though right now. 'Kay, I gotta go to church now, oh." This single paragraph painted the portrait of a cold-blooded killer, not someone who acted out of anger or trauma, but someone who did it just to feel what it was like. A teenager who had grown so emotionally numb, so disconnected from human empathy, that she resorted to taking an innocent child's life just to see if it would make her feel anything. And later, when interrogated by police, she admitted that she had been thinking about killing someone for a while and chose Elizabeth because she was small, easy to control, and would likely follow her into the woods without suspicion. Alyssa Bustamante was charged with first-degree murder and tried as an adult, a move that outraged some and relieved others, but it was undeniable that the crime she committed wasn't one of youthful impulse or sudden rage. It was calculated, rehearsed, and executed with chilling precision. And during her court hearings, prosecutors played clips from her YouTube channel where she laughed maniacally, posted videos about death and pain, and even discussed cutting herself in the past, which all added to the growing evidence that Alyssa was deeply disturbed and perhaps dangerously disconnected from reality. Her defense team argued that Alyssa had a troubled upbringing. Her mother was a drug addict, her father was in prison, and she had bounced around foster homes before finally being adopted by her grandmother, who tried her best to provide stability. And they noted that Alyssa had been hospitalized for depression, was taking Prozac at the time of the murder, and had a long history of self-harm, suggesting that her mental health should be taken into account when considering sentencing. But the prosecution pushed back hard, reading her diary entry aloud in court and reminding the jury that this wasn't a girl who accidentally went too far. This was someone who planned it, enjoyed it, and expressed more regret over getting caught than over taking a child's life. And in the end, to avoid the possibility of life without parole, Alyssa accepted a plea deal, admitting guilt to second-degree murder and armed criminal action, receiving a sentence of life with the possibility of parole plus 30 years. Elizabeth's mother broke down in court during sentencing, telling Alyssa directly that her actions destroyed a family and left a permanent scar on everyone who loved Elizabeth, and to this day, the community still mourns the little girl who never made it home that October night. While Alyssa, now a grown woman, continues to serve her time in prison, her next parole hearing scheduled for 2029. She didn't kill out of rage or revenge. She killed because she was curious, because she wanted to feel something. And according to her own journal, her only regret was that she didn't enjoy it more. Case number 5, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier. They believed they were following orders from a faceless creature, a monstrous entity they had never met in person. But this was not a fairy tale, and the victim would pay the price for their misguided obsession. In May of 2014, two 12-year-old girls, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier, from Waukesha, Wisconsin, committed an unimaginable crime. They lured their best friend, Peyton Lutner, into the woods and brutally stabbed her 19 times. The reason? They believed that by sacrificing Peyton to the Slender Man, a fictional character born from internet horror stories, they would earn his favor and be welcomed into his world. The horrifying part of this case was not just the act itself but the mentality of the perpetrators, two young girls who at the time were barely teenagers, convinced they were carrying out a ritual demanded by an online entity that had become an obsession in their lives. 4 months, they had been consumed by the Slender Man mythology, spending hours online researching his story, talking about him, and even plotting to prove their loyalty to him. They felt they had no choice but to follow his commands to avoid his wrath, convinced he would harm their families if they didn't comply. On that fateful day, Peyton, who had been friends with both Morgan and Anissa, was invited for a walk in the woods. What seemed like a harmless outing with friends turned into a brutal attack. The two girls pushed Peyton to the ground and without warning they began stabbing her. Morgan, who had planned the attack, focused on Peyton's chest, while Anissa held her down. Despite the vicious assault, Peyton managed to crawl to a nearby road, where she was found by a passing cyclist, covered in blood but still alive. Miraculously, Peyton survived the attack. She was rushed to the hospital, and although the injuries were life-threatening, she recovered after extensive surgery and physical therapy. The authorities quickly arrested Morgan and Anissa, and during their interrogation, both girls explained that they had planned the murder for months, believing that sacrificing Peyton would grant them protection and lead to their acceptance into the Slender Man's domain. They believed that he would reward them and that they would have the power to do anything they wanted. In court, the prosecution argued that the girls were fully aware of their actions, but the defense suggested that they were mentally unstable and heavily influenced by the Slender Man lore. Morgan and Anissa were both charged with attempted first-degree murder, and their trials generated national attention, with debates over their mental state, their age, and their responsibility for their actions. Morgan Geyser was found to be not guilty by reason of insanity and was sentenced to 40 years to life in a psychiatric facility. Anissa Wire, on the other hand, pleaded guilty to attempted second-degree homicide and was sentenced to 25 years to life in a psychiatric institution. These girls didn't just commit a crime, they were led down a dark, twisted path by the lure of a fictional monster. Their case raised critical questions about the dangers of online culture, the influence of social media, and the fragile boundaries between reality and fiction in young minds. Innocence is not always what it seems. And age does not always protect you from darkness. These chilling stories remind us that even the most innocent-looking faces can conceal a terrifying darkness. Children are often seen as symbols of purity and hope for the future, but what happens when they turn their violence inward or towards others? Can a child truly be capable of evil, or do these young killers reflect something deeper? Something in their environment? Are they simply the products of trauma, neglect, or psychological damage? So what do you think? Can a child be evil? Or is every young killer just a product of trauma and neglect? These questions are not easy to answer, and each case reveals more about the complex nature of human behavior. Some of these stories hint at the influence of mental illness, others at deep-seated psychological wounds, and still others at chilling, deliberate violence. Leave your thoughts below because we read them all. And if this story chilled you like it did me, subscribe for more real crime stories that go beneath the surface.